Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Neil Smelser, who is University Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Berkeley. He's the author of a new book, Reflections on the University of California, From the Free Speech Movement to the Global University. Neil, welcome back to our program.
Thank you very much, Harry.
What makes the University of California such a distinctive institution?
Well, I'd say this, you have to start with the fact that it's a public institution, and in the history of the American higher education, even though public institutions have been honored and favored, they've also tended to always be in the shadow of the privates and model themselves after the privates as much as they can, but at the same time they're under constraints of public accountability, responsibility, and serving of a population of their own states and sometimes larger populations. Well, California somehow or other, being both rich and in a very rich state, and also with imaginative leadership, managed to kind of break through this line. Berkeley for a long time has always seen itself as oriented toward the great private institutions of the East. And that has helped them, and the state has been generous enough so that they have been able to compete with them. And with the added resources of a cleverly invented governance structure, plus a lot of gold flowing from the state, plus faculty involvement that is always made for high commitment that you do not often find in state institutions because they move in bureaucratic directions. They often don't have the same loyalty, except perhaps in athletics, of their members. So it just has all flown together. I would have to add at the end, a beautiful climate and a beautiful state has helped a lot.
And you bring up again and again this relation to the state, and we'll talk more about that later. But it's really one thing that stands out is the university was a key pillar of the California dream, which was sort of the fulfillment of a middle class succeeding and upwardly mobile.
Well, I've spoken in this book and on many occasions of this unique combination of competitive excellence and egalitarianism wrapped in the same institution. Very rare to have a stable combination in any institution of higher education of those two principles because they fight against each other in some regards. California, both in its history and in particular in the development of the master plan, seemed to work out an ingenious combination. The university at the very beginning was always comparing itself, if you look in the historical records, always comparing itself with the Harvards and Princetons of the world, and not the Michigans and not the Texas. So at the same time, California is a very egalitarian state, as shown in its populism and its constitution and so on. And somehow or other, this idea of elitism combined with the capacity to move people upward, I think California had the best solution for that.
Now, as we talk about the issues that have evolved over time in the years that you're covering, say from the 60s to the present, let's talk a little about your roles at the university, because in a way, I think you almost served in every role except you weren't a student here. So let's talk about that. You've looked at all of this from all sides now. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, I was never a student, and I never got into you might say, the line authority of the university of being a chancellor or being a dean. You know, of the really official hierarchy I stayed out of, but was always on the side of. And I wasn't a student here. I was a student of a private institution on the East Coast and came out here right after getting my PhD.
But as a university professor later in your career, you taught on every campus.
Not every. I was appointed university professor in 1971. And I taught on 5 campuses other than Berkeley, sometimes more than once, on invitation, by arrangement, and so on. So that was one entree into knowing the larger system. And then, of course, a few years or a decade later, I got involved in Academic Senate and actually chaired the system-wide Academic Senate. And my involvement with the President's Office also involved me with the entire university.
And you've been a formal and informal advisor to chancellors on the campus.
Yes, this has been really fortunate. I mean, I just looking at it from my own point of view, it's very rare that a person can be a citizen of the university and get so involved in the core of the university without becoming a formal administrator of the university. I don't know that that's a really unique role, and I've felt so good. I mean, in a way, you can be a little cynical about it. You can say it's really nice to have a touch with power but no real responsibility, which is the kind of advising roles that I've been in. But on the other hand, that's worked out. The structure of the university permits this sort of thing, and then people recognize me as a person who could be of value, and I carved out this very informal and unique role.
Now, there are two other aspects to your career. You're also a psychoanalyst.
Yes.
And then as a sociologist, you work on collective behavior. So to what extent did those two aspects of your background contribute to your insights in these various roles?
Well, it so happened that my major work on collective behavior, which I guess I'm best known for professionally, was published in 1962, right on the eve of all the disturbances. And this was a massive treatise on panics, crazes, riots, social movements, revolutionary movements, religious cults, and so on. So I really did a kind of encyclopedic coverage and really did gain quite a lot of knowledge as the dynamics of these. Now, in the book, I address this question directly of whether or not advising and being in positions of responsibility, you can really apply social science, such as insights I got about collective behavior and social movements. Direct applications are a fantasy. I mean, you can't develop formulas as to deal with things. However, perspectives that you develop and general findings and an orienting framework toward what's going on in movements that are otherwise somewhat indecipherable, my work helped me a great deal in this. Also, the work on psychoanalysis, not directly applicable, often provide the key to understanding things which would otherwise be completely anomalous and mysterious. Ambivalences, for example, behavior that appears to be non-rational or irrational. Somehow or other you can bring insights and begin to at least think about it, massage it, and get a better control on what is often a very uncontrollable social situation.
Especially the work in sociology would seem to make you aware of the larger context.
Well, here's a specific example.
Yeah.
I asked in my scholarly work, what happens when a social movement scores a stunning success? And I looked into a tremendous amount of research on this topic. And I concluded that it generally undergoes some kind of crisis. It searches around for new things to do. It tries to keep its members loyal. It fragments and goes off in different directions, trying to write a new agenda for itself or try to safeguard what it's got before. But it's, generally speaking, successful social movements become confused social movements. And that's what I mean, I didn't say this is my formula for dealing with it, but that's what I observed in what happened to the free speech movement. I mean, it was just a clinical case as far as those effects were concerned. In that respect, that I was better equipped.
Before we walk you through the free speech movement, let's talk a minute about the book and its overall landscape. Why did you write the book, and what is the book made of, basically?
Well, over the years, various colleagues have recognized this kind of unique role that I've had in the university and asked me to write some kind of memoirs or some kind of accounts of the different aspects of things. And I always had a reluctance I felt that to be something of a self-indulgence on my part. But, these requests and these advice and these interests did, in fact, get into my consciousness. And about 5 years ago, particularly, I've written one of the chapters I'll call the Surprises at Berkeley. I began thinking and actually looking around at what I'd actually written on the University of California and how much of it had been published and how much had not. And as it turned out, I'd written several essays and studies of aspects, and they had been published, but this was really about only a quarter to a third of the book length. But in the meantime, in different assignments and different jobs that I'd often written up diagnoses of situations for the benefit of my administrative employers, if you will. And as I looked around, it turned out to be quite a significant body of work that hadn't been made public. In addition, I had served in this unusual role as chair of a number of very influential commissions over the years, especially in the last couple of decades of the 20th century. And these had not been officially published, even though they were made available, but they were in a way diagnostic and policy documents that I thought were worthy putting together. So having all this together, the advice, and also with a long-term determination of writing up my involvement in the free speech movement, all these flowed together. I floated the idea to the University of California Press. They were very happy about it, and there we were.
Let's talk now about the free speech movement. When did you come to Berkeley as a faculty member, and then when were you called to be an advisor to the chancellor? Place us to the time here.
I joined the Berkeley faculty in 1958. This was in part of that golden age that people refer to of harmony, excellence, and a feeling of great optimism and expansion, and a low level of conflict in the university. That was 6 years before the free speech movement hit, and it hit like a bombshell. In the free speech movement itself, that is to say the last month of 1964, I wasn't especially active, and I did not join any one of these pioneer groups that were going to save the Lone Ranger groups that sprung up during the crisis, even though I did join a few temporarily peacemaking efforts, but never public. And it was only after the free speech movement and the really dramatic events of December 1964, when the faculty joined the students, when the December 8th resolution was passed, when Chancellor Strong was in effect discharged, and Meyerson came in. Out of the blue, I got this invitation to be his advisor in the area of student political activity. I've never figured out why that happened, or who advised him to select me, or what credentials he perceived me as having. All this is a big mystery to me, but that was the beginning. January 1965, that I became his special assistant, and we had an extremely dramatic 8 months together. But in a way, that kind of set the tone for the kind of role I was going to play from then on.
And if we date the free speech movement at the time of your appointment, it's on the threshold of the decline that you described.
Well, it was flush with victory.
Yeah.
In the early meetings we had with the steering committee of the free speech movement, there was euphoria. I mean, that was like a kind of a messianic feeling among the activists who'd been involved in the free speech movement. They had great hopes. They weren't terribly well articulated, but they saw educational reform. They saw a kind of utopian political Hyde Park atmosphere of the university and so on. So it was still strong, but it had to be at an anticlimax because of the events of late December and its victory, and then the progressive withdrawing of faculty support during that time, and the ensuing confusion. Yes, I'd have to say that in those 8 months, I witnessed the effective death of the free speech movement, even though vitality was subsequently infused into protest activities by the Vietnamese War.
And it's very important to say here, I think, and you say this in the book, that a number of the issues that came up sort of reflected on the one hand, the insignificance of issues such as obscenity, a journal called The Spider. They were apparently insignificant, and they were insignificant, but they raised the possibility of outside constituencies being drawn in to increase the turmoil on the campus. Is that fair? Or?
Well, what happened was, in this search for new things, a small minority headed by Goldberg,
who was a member of the steering committee.
He was a steering committee member, and he got in his mind that free speech included the rights to utter obscenities in public, right? And it was in a way silly, but in a way it was, in retrospect, it was he handed the university a terrific opportunity to be able to deal in terms of organized procedures with restoring some capacity to discipline students and others on the campus, to restore authority. That was a boon. At the same time, those episodes involving obscenity, among other things, excited a reaction around the state, including in the legislature and the regions, of absolute hostility. A right wing, I call it a counter-revolution that failed, to come in and just beat the university up over this. They didn't think it was silly. They thought it was outrageous behavior on the campus. That was historically, I thought it was a pain in the neck at the time, but historically proved to be a kind of strange saving episode for the University of California at Berkeley.
You, at one point in your book, and I wanted to emphasize this because you're sort of setting the stage for understanding these times, and you talk about the enormous growth of the University of California in the period of the mid-50s to where we were when the free speech movement came. And I'll just cite some. Campus enrollment grew from 14,927 in 53 to 26,939 in 1964, a growth of about 80%. The regular faculty grew 18% in contrast to a student population growth of 80%. An increase in the non-faculty research personnel, an increase in the number of lecturers, and then the number of TAs, that is, graduate students who were aiding in courses, growing from 565 in 1953 to close to 1,500 in 1964, essentially an enormous, a tripling here of the numbers. So as an analyst now, you have pointed us to the kind of the possible volatility of the situation when the movement came along.
I once did an informal survey, which I never published or never even formally completed, of institutions that were tended to be adversely affected by conflict in a period of about 15 years. And one of the things that struck me was that many of them had grown rapidly, and that somehow or other that's created some kind of a series of anomalies. In the particular case of Berkeley, this fantastic increase of ancillary personnel, like these non-faculty research personnel, teaching assistants, lecturers, and so on. There's an economic logic for why that happened in terms of funds availability and the needs of the state. But the effect that struck me most of all was that it created large bodies of second-class citizens with the faculty as the reference point, right? They're all unprivileged with respect to the faculty in one way or another. Not that this automatically alienates this group, but somehow or other it creates issues. And we did find a very heavy involvement of teaching assistants, for example, in the free speech movement among the graduate students. There's a marginal role in the setting of the university. So the combination of very rapid growth plus the fact of possible alienation, I saw as a bedrock of potential for serious conflict.
And the previous administration to Meyerson, Strong his leadership had collapsed because of his, I guess we would say, authoritarian way of dealing with the situation that we're describing. And interestingly enough, in your work on collective behavior, you had identified kind of a failure of leadership. Talk a little about that, namely a movement from weakness to overreaction.
Well, yes, it's not fair to call him an authoritarian. Matter of fact, he was a liberal as far as his politics and philosophy were concerned. However, he managed during the period leading up to 1960s, early 1960s, to get himself unpopular with large numbers of faculty members. There was a strange, now remote case of Katz in which he was it was about signing or not revealing Communist Party membership, and Strong took a hard line on this, and a faculty censured him at one point. It's not very publicly known, but nonetheless, there was a discontent with Strong as being a weak leader, if I might pun a little bit. Then, and he was also kind of an amateur. He had a kind of traditional view of students as being, well, they should study, right? They should stay out of trouble, and they should he saw protest as misbehavior, right? So this combination led him to take rather authoritarian stands against student protest and to crack down on them. Then when they kind of got out of hand, the administration collapsed. That's the formula that I saw as being deadly. Cracking down, then collapsing. Cracking down, then collapsing. It creates both a boldness on the part of the students because they see an administration as weak, and it also creates the capacity for victimization, which is a tremendous asset for any protest movement. That's the kind of dynamics I saw as leading up to the great success of the free speech movement.
Now, as an actor, and then in thinking about this later in a paper that was commissioned by John Cummins in the Chancellor's office, I think developed a notion of, on the one hand, the skills that are required of a leader. And as you describe what you were doing and what Meyerson was doing, one has a sense of kind of authority. I think you call it authority by default, that you're presented with a situation and you figure out a way to deal with it. But there is, your stance and style seems to be one of neutrality, of listening to all sides and then navigating the shoals, so to speak.
This, I've interesting reflections on this and as to what contributed to an administrative style. I'll speak for myself because I know more about myself. When I was in 7th grade, Emerson School in Phoenix, Arizona, a teacher one day, after class, stopped me in the hall, began to have a conversation with me. She said, "You should become a diplomat." 12 years old, 13 years old. And I was totally stunned by this because I never saw myself as in anything like that kind of personality. But somehow or other, she did. I think I did have a kind of a personality quality of being not weak but not offensive to other people, and also keeping a little bit of critical distance from things. Maybe that's what she saw, I don't know. But anyway, I felt the role in the Chancellor's office, which involved neutrality, patience, non-vindictiveness, even when you felt like being vindictive, to be great assets, personal assets. I say that in all modesty, that I seem to fit into the kind of needs or the appropriate time. Because if we'd come in after the free speech movement and led a major crackdown, we would have just created tremendous chaos. Now, we got criticized from the right for this low-key exercise of authority, definite exercise of authority, but more on the low-key thing. The right got really sore at us and thought we were all soft, and that may have cost Meyerson his permanent chancellorship, that the regents thought he wasn't tough enough. So you get that from the right. But at the same time, on the spot where we were, I thought that idea of gentleness but not collapsing was, I didn't articulate it. This is all afterwards. Proved to be the appropriate formula for the moment.
Mm-hmm. And one I think we need to point out, as you do very well in this book, and I recommend that people look at the book because we can't cover everything in an hour, that why this strategy made sense was because of the political volatility that had been created on the campus. So in this world of change, with the outside, the legislature, the regents trying to intervene, there was a very complex political situation on the campus. A whole array of constituencies, when the wrong button was pushed, would lead to divisions not only between the constituencies, but within the constituencies. Yes. Talk about that.
Yes, it was very, very volatile situation, and every constituency on campus was divided. You look at faculty, you had a remainder of a kind of a hard left faculty who supported the students and their continuing demands. You had a right wing kind of a really strong counter and authoritarian movement that John Lawrence and other people headed up, and then you had the middle of the faculty that they wanted their faculty lives to be undisturbed. They weren't passionate about politics, but you got all these different combinations could happen. The student movement was fractured. The politics of the time were that those who were activists, both on the right and the left, fed on crisis. That's where they made their moves, and that's where they got their support on crises in which they appeared to be their backs were against the wall, or they're being persecuted, or something like that. And I guess if I reflect on this, our major administrative demand was to defuse and just not let those crises form, and that's a formidable demand on the part of an administration, and it's not as dramatic as flourishing and so on as other administrative styles, but as I say, it seemed to fit the times.
Now, you go on in one of the chapters, includes a report that you did for the chancellor's office on, well, how do you think about surprises? Because the history of the University of California, and I'm aware of this because I've been here at the Institute of International Studies, is a series of unexpected surprises. The anti-apartheid movement, the incident over the failed lecture by Ambassador Kirkpatrick, affirmative action, and it was part of the excitement of being at Berkeley that many of these issues would arise here in the first instance and then spread internationally. So you thought about the problem of, well, how do you prepare for a surprise, and then what is the structure of authority that deals with them? Talk a little about that.
Well, by and large, a university is not an institution that is very well prepared to handle surprises, particularly political surprises. It's an institution dating from monastic times, which has been pretty isolated from politics and society, even though it's considered to be an asset for culture and society. And there's a lot of make-believe on the part of faculty administrators that it's not a political organization, that we're a company of equals, we're serene, we're isolated, and those things don't happen. That means that surprises, ugly surprises, are always unanticipated, and very little institution. And when they go away, people just, thank goodness we're back to normal. And so there are very little institutional experience in dealing with collective political situations characterizes universities. I've seen over the years that any time a crisis happens of the sorts you mentioned, there's a scrambling of activity, meetings, phone calls, so it's this and that, everything, and as though nothing has ever happened before like it. It's just ad hoc, inventive dealings with surprises. So in my essay, I said, well, what is it that makes a surprise? I did an analysis of the concept of surprise for an institution and laid out a kind of theory of that a surprise is an interaction between an event and a range of interested constituencies who then zero in on the university and create an urgent, critical situation for it, and confusing situation for it because they're unprepared. And that was the lines of analysis that I took up and illustrated over a 40 to 50 year period, and then made some suggestions as to how you might get some machinery available that might anticipate surprises and enable the institution to deal with them as problems rather than surprises, or even more crises which it faces. So this was a kind of a you might say a handbook, this essay on surprises, because the university has so often just been taken. The fact that it's an important university makes it even more so, because people are magnetized by power or influence or prestige. The press loves to see the University of California and other major institutions in some kind of trouble. They just meet for the press. And so it's just kind of, and with the volatile changes going on in larger society, it's just a recipe for more turbulence in the university setting than people like to accept.
I would conclude from reading your book that on the one hand, universities, as they adapt to change in the society and the crises that presented with it, that on one hand you're looking for a kind of a routinization, using Weber's term, and you use that, of processes, but a flexibility and a openness to the new currents in society to sort of anticipate the issues, and so that what you're trying to do as a university administrator, which you were not, you were an advisor, is to bring these two things together so that you're not cutting. So for example, the anti-apartheid movement, one doesn't think of it in anything but a positive way, but as an issue that the university must respond to, then those two things have to come together.
Well, one of the unique things that characterizes conflicts for university administrations, and this has shown up in the reactions to the recent disturbances over fee increases, mm-hmm. as the university finds itself in an anomalous position of agreeing with a lot of the protest, but also constrained to maintain the integrity of its own processes, and that opposes them to certain types of protest, and also the inability to satisfy the demands of the protesters. All those come in together. That's a very, very tricky kind of political role to be in, to have those three types of forces working on you in any given kind of crisis. I must say that, that Committee on Surprises came out of a surprise, the SARS epidemic, mm-hmm. in which we got in trouble with Asians over canceling programs. It became a matter of face, and the Asian American alumni got mad, and then came the long period of unruffling ruffled feathers. And our surprise committee just sat down and said, what's on the horizon over the next 6 months? What might be the problem? So we talked about the Patriot Act, we talked about admissions policies, we talked about lingering problems of affirmative action, and just tried to identify where that was an amateur effort. But if you could build this into the university's routine functioning, I think it would be very valuable.
Let's talk a little about affirmative action, because it posed an interesting set of dilemmas in the sense that it really raised important issues in society. In an upward mobile state like California, it seemed to raise questions about the rules of the university in terms of rewarding merit. But you point out something very interesting, which made it an especially difficult problem for university administration, is that universities are used to dealing with individuals.
Yes.
And suddenly it was being presented with group demands. Let's focus on that, and what were the challenges there?
Well, institutionally, that's what universities are about. They admit students, they teach students as students, they discipline students individually, they graduate individual students, and much of their collective activity is tightly institutionalized, like bands and clubs and sororities, fraternity, and so on. Collectives too that are not really political. Now, when you get a categorical group demanding collective action on the part of an institution, they don't know what to do, and they don't have the machinery to deal with it. So that really is connected with a good deal of this awkwardness that I spoke about earlier. You just don't have the machinery or the mental set to deal with these kinds of demands. The other dilemma that was created, especially for the faculty lives comfortably with the idea of meritocracy, right? Because it stresses excellence, and it also stresses the possibility that good people can rise to the top. Now, affirmative action in some respects split these commitments of faculty liberalism. In other words, in many respects, affirmative action is attractive because it lets previously underprivileged people move in and move toward the top. But at the same time, to say that they do so on a categorical basis rather than strictly ability offends that side of the meritocracy philosophy of faculty. So they were torn. This was a crisis for liberal faculty as much as anything else.
And it was also something that really generated a lot of opposition outside the university, from legislators on one side or the other, but also conservatives on the Board of Regents.
Everybody was, affirmative action was one of those long historical periods in which practically everybody involved was ambivalent. That's why I employ this idea of the politics of ambivalence in talking about affirmative action as well as multiculturalism. It confused everybody's understandings about how the place should be operating. So consequently, you got standoffs within constituencies and standoffs between constituencies, and an extremely fluid idea. Furthermore, affirmative action, I say this quite frankly, fits American primary values in that it is an effort to right wrongs and to give a chance to the underprivileged, but at the same time, the categorical aspect flies in the face of American individualism. So that fundamental conflict built into affirmative action and its policies and its practices was bound to divide everybody, depending on which side of this dilemma they chose.
And ultimately, this set of problems turned to an emphasis once you had implemented procedures to open the university up more, began to focus on cultures and the notion of bringing other cultures to the table of the curriculum, and in fact, building up cultures where they were weak.
Well, the history of affirmative action and its offshoots is really a history of demands for, you might say, economic and social representation in not only universities but in all institutions. That then took a cultural turn. It was part of the cultural turn in general, but the dynamics I sort of appealed to was, well, yes, once you get people in and participating in this basically traditional institution, they begin to see it's not their institution. And so that the access, which in fact is benefit, turns into a new deprivation. So then arises a kind of escalation into the fact that this is run by the Anglo establishment, old men, straight persons and everything, which is a derived sort of dissatisfaction following upon a certain amount of success.
Another area that you worked on was in your role as advisor with many portfolios was thinking about athletics. And athletics is a kind of problem that's different in the sense that outsiders are very interested in a gung-ho sort of way. They want to support athletics and so on, but it's a dilemma for the university. What were the particular problems there in sorting that out?
Well, it's very interesting to have a faculty member involved in generating or helping generate athletic policy, because there's traditionally faculty attitudes toward athletics have been rigidly fixed. The vast majority are indifferent. There are some fans and some rooters among faculty, but there's a bedrock of faculty sentiment that thinks it's a waste of time. It's a misdirection of the university. It's anti-academic, and it soaks up all the resources. It's a greedy institution. So you're already in a kind of minefield if you even go into this. And Chancellor Tien in the 90s was of the gung-ho variety. He wanted to build up Cal Athletics, which had been floundering in mediocrity for four decades, and he was unashamed about it. Now, he formed this commission he really gave a big blue ribbon commission on intercollegiate athletics. And he hoped, I believe he hoped, even though he didn't try to influence the committee directly, to get some greater affirmation of the place and value of competitive intercollegiate athletics in the university setting. He asked me to chair this thing. Once again, some of these assignments are somewhat mysterious. To me, I was a sort of fan, but I wasn't in the hostile segment of the university, and I suppose that was a good reason to be a chair. But it was made of alumni, some administrators, and some faculty. And we came up with a report. It was the most controversial committee I've ever served as chairman on.
And why is that?
Because of the passions, mainly of the alumni. Every alumni who cares about athletics knows exactly what went wrong where, and what has to be done to get it right. And they're very public, almost religious in their commitments about athletics. So I got delegations and individuals, and the coaches and their staffs are also highly jurisdictional about theirs. So you're in a minefield of really strong jurisdictional turf conflicts in the whole thing. And I think I was most challenged of any committee I've ever served on to kind of hold the line against intervention.
And is this about resources, recruitment? I mean, what are the stickiest issues?
Well, there was an obvious sticky one, namely that the university was completely behind the integration of men's and women's athletics. We were one of 6 in the country that hadn't merged.
And were required to by Title IX.
That's right. We were evading the law, and in fact, though we weren't being prosecuted. And so this was a kind of a slam dunk. We said, do it. I mean, get in line and so on. But then we had issues of finance. It's greediness. We had issues of coverage of all athletics versus non-coverage of all. We had the issues of student athletes and their preparation and their involvement in a first-rate university academically. And we had issues of internal structural organization of athletics on the Berkeley campus, which was completely archaic and unsystematic. These were the issues that we developed. But the key one that got all the attention was that at the beginning I drafted some material and I said, there are three ways in which universities can deal with athletics. They can be top competitors, they can be mediocre, or they can just decide they don't want to care about them, the University of Chicago type. And I said, Berkeley's always been ambivalent. It likes to be in a big, powerful conference, but it settles for mediocrity. He said, this is an unsatisfactory long-term thing. Either decide you're going to compete in a competitive environment or you get out. But don't just sort of waffle around between the two. Well, in a way, Chancellor Tien only heard the first one, namely, get competitive. So that report got used by both athletics and administrators to build up into what has been a move toward competitive excellence in Cal athletics since the time. And it's always cited, and now it's being cited as giving too much to athletics, which are draining too much of the university budget in hard times. So this got dissatisfactions from one side and the other side, which I suppose makes it a pretty good report.
In your first role, you were walking to Sproul on the occasion of an incident or something. So you were kind of in the field as things were changing. But obviously, in a report like this, it becomes something different. And I'm curious about what are the skills here? That is, seeing the complexity, and then but also leading through drafts and a final report, so that there is a document that transcends being something that you just put in a file cabinet, but rather something that points the direction for future problems?
Well, I guess I'd have to immodestly say that to issue a statement, a policy statement, and recommendations on a controversial area, in fact, does drive you in the direction of being a little bit more of an authoritarian and a manager of things. Otherwise, you're going to reflect a hodgepodge of opinions, and you come out with 75 recommendations, each giving somebody something and dying as a result because it satisfies nobody, and that's what gets put on the shelves and never read. But here, in each case, I think I exercised what I called a non-authoritarian pushiness on my committees. Letting them know we have a limited number of things we want to say, and we're not going to go beyond that number, and we're not going to waffle. We're going to decide that we're going to do our best shot at figuring a situation out, and we're going to do our best shot at recommending something, and we're going to limit these to the most important. Those were characteristics of that report and a number of others that I think gave them some additional influence so that we otherwise wouldn't have had. But it did take a certain amount of this authoritarian, non-pushy authoritarianism on my part.
Your book, in a way, can be looked at as a description and an analysis of the changes of that occurred in an era, an important era for the University of California, an era of enormous growth. And I have the sense, after reading the book, that this is a kind of a description of an era that may, in some respects, be ending today because of the current, financial crisis and other dilemmas of the university. I want to know if I'm wrong about that. And I guess the question I would ask, built on what you've witnessed, the intellectual journey, being an actor in the university's process, what do you see as the major threats confronting the university today, and what can we bring from this period that you describe to deal with those threats?
I don't believe the era of conflict is over, and there are many reasons to bolster this opinion. First of all, the number of constituencies that feel they have some stake in the university has done nothing but grown. As government has gotten a business of funding it, as industry gets more in the business of funding it, as the state still is there from a governance point of view but is funding it less, and you've got all kinds of social movements in the society, animal rights, human rights, environmentalism, gender equality, and so on, social movements that think the university is an appropriate target and begin working on them. Now, this is so that the multiplication of external interested constituencies is going to guarantee future conflict because everybody is going to get their hand in that pot. So that's not over. The fact that public institutions like Berkeley are suffering long-term downturns in their financial support from the state mean that they have to involve themselves in ever more constituencies, private giving, business arrangements with corporations, continuing efforts to get federal money and so on, makes their job much more complex. So that you have, and furthermore, the university is motivated on this basis to be uncontroversial. That's the leadership of institutions. The era of the statesman-like president, like Nicholas Murray Butler, James Bryan Conant, Robert Hutchins, I think that era is over. We're entering an era of managerialism and crisis management because of those changes that I've just detailed.
In one of your reports, you identify looming problems. And let's talk a minute about this present context, serving students and residents of California. In the book, you see the problem focused around decreasing support, but greater accountability is the dichotomy you present. That seems to be continuing to be the case, because as the university is not able to get the public support it wants, whereas there are more and more demands by parents and students for the quality education that Berkeley always was.
And on top of that, you have to see the university as one of the victims of what I've referred to from time to time as accountability mania in the larger society. That is, accountability used to mean that you spent the money the way you said you were going to spend the money. Now we're entered into this area of performance accountability and measures and indices and quantifiable results of outputs and targets and so on and so forth, all of which come mostly out of the state, but sometimes out of funders who are interested in results of what they've poured into the university. So that, along with you've identified it, that along with the financial struggle has led to a politically overburdened situation for the university. Will also continue. The
subtitle of the book is From Free Speech Movement to the Global University. Let's talk about research. Do you think, what will be the problem for funding research? I just had a guest on the program, Steve Cohen, and he has a new book, and he's talking about the immense power of the sovereign funds of many states and so on. Where will we be looking to funding? Do you see that as a great challenge? Funding from private corporations will have to continue, maybe from foreign governments. Will that affect the integrity of the university, and what do we do to avoid that?
Absolutely. Every time you receive, you form a constituency. The university has been well protected by mechanisms such as not dictating lines of research and not dictating personnel who get appointed to the faculty. They've saved their skin in a way from these gross types of interventions. However, you might say the cultural mentality of the increase, those sources that are increasing or continuing strong, like government and business, tend to contain more compromises for the university in its traditional role. The history of the labs is a very interesting one, as being highly cluttered and surrounded by secrecy and clearance, and is foreign to the open public dissemination of results by university. So we had
It's the weapons labs you're talking about.
Weapons labs, that's what I mean. That's been a constant source of tension and not being able to hire graduate students because they haven't been cleared and so on and so forth. That's a big problem. Business creates others. You get in the business of protecting industrial secrets, which is also counter to the university's public policies. You get into conflicts of interest because faculty members get drawn out of their role and get paid enormous sums by business for involvement and so on. And you get industrial secrets and patenting issues and so on. All of these news sources. I mean, the naive idea that the university receives money and does what it best thinks it should do with it is over. There are just more and more interest in targeted missions for the university, and it's I will not predict it's a losing battle, but it's a constant battle.
Do you think that the problem will lead to an uneven development on the campus? Fields like yours, the social sciences, the humanities, they probably are going to have great difficulty in the future. Question mark, I don't know, getting funding for research in a way that, engineering and the sciences might not have.
That's not a new trend. I mean, big-time federal funding favored the sciences from the very beginning. It spilled over into the social sciences to some degree because, as I might say, second cousins, because many people in the funding areas, plus political efforts on the part of those associations, are kind of convinced that social sciences are of some value. The humanities have had a long-term defensive decline. And I see that given the trends that I've analyzed, I can only see that continuing. It's quite profound because It intensifies the internal stratification within universities, with faculty members getting more pay from the scientists and time off and all the perks and so on, and increasing alienation and bitterness on the part of those underprivileged disciplines that are scrambling to survive as a part of a general university.
What would you like the public audience to understand as the takeaway point from your book, your essays, but more importantly, your reflections on the university? I mean, what is most important for the supporters of the university to understand about the University of California and Berkeley?
Well, that question is fundamentally impossible, so I don't know that I can say anything very intelligent about it. One of the trends that I like to call the culture of impatience has become ever more salient in our society. Both moral demands as well as instrumental demands, competitive demands emanating from cultural globalization and other forces. And this sort of passion for results, passion for accountability, passion for practical, and that is an environment in which the university is, it finds itself beleaguered. And also, insofar as we really value the traditional idea of a liberal institution that is completely free and covers things on the basis of its search for truth rather than some practical or vocational purpose, is getting so shortchanged that my really long-term worry is whether or not the idea of a liberal university will survive.
Well, on that note, Neil, I want to thank you very much. I want to show your book again. And thank you very much for coming on our program and sharing your reflections on the university.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.